Welcome to the Curzon Salon. I'm thrilled to be here and about to interview a very, very special guest called Michael Bociurkiw. Welcome, Michael.
Good day. Good to be with you, Farzana.
So for the audience, Michael is a writer. He's a global affairs analyst, a speaker, and a humanitarian. You may recognize him. He's constantly on CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, and a number of other networks around the world, covering a number of topics from tech to the White House to health to vaccine issues around COVID. And obviously, he has a lot of experience prior to COVID, having worked on polio and a number of others. Now, obviously, tech and COVID have both been huge twin accelerators of pre-existing trends taking place in the way we live, the way we work, the way we communicate. And what's been quite interesting is obviously also the rise of geopolitical tensions between America and China. And I read recently one of the analysts is sort of forecasting that China would actually take over from the US in terms of its economy in 2028, so sort of 7 years away. And so countries obviously are going to be increasingly trapped between these two superpowers, but also companies as well. If you look at Huawei, if you look at TikTok, so it isn't business as usual, especially when it comes to companies that have access to critical infrastructure, such as Huawei, or access to data such as TikTok. So what I wanted to ask from your perspective is, obviously, we have a new change coming in the White House. From your perspective, do you feel as if Biden's going to adopt a different tone, a different approach to China? Because even though obviously he isn't Trump, and he's very far from Trump in terms of his tone and his approach and his policies, but fundamentally China does remain a country to be reckoned with, a country that is very different in culture and the way they work from the US. Obviously, next year, we also see the 100-year anniversary of the China Communist Party. China's going from strength to strength. How do you feel Biden will approach China?
It's a great question and very relevant. Well, first of all, with Mr. Trump, I think Beijing is very happy to see him go. If he goes, that remains to be seen. But I think they feel very much bullied by Mr. Trump and his circle. Look, this is a man who took the kind of traditional approaches to diplomacy. He took existing models and just busted them up, including the multilateral system. So in a way, ironically, he's created an opportunity for Biden to kind of take that system and rebuild it, to build back better in better ways, because we have to admit, I mean, institutions like the UN have been very, very inefficient. There's been a lot of corruption in some of its agencies. So there is a great opportunity here for Biden to pick those pieces up and rebuild them better. Having said that, I don't think that Biden and Senator Harris will be embracing China very tightly. You will recall, even under the Obama administration, there was a lot of, I would say, paranoia to China's tactics, cyber meddling, meddling with elections. It's very, very provocative actions in the South China Sea, grabbing disputed territories, deploying its navy there, intimidating neighbors like the Philippines, Malaysia, and so on. And then it's very interesting to watch China. What's happened also under Trump is that kind of very, very quietly and subtly, China has been filling the void created by the exit of the United States, not only from the world stage, but from agencies like the World Health Organization, WTO. So you may recall a few months ago that China pledged a lot, and I mean a lot of money to the WHO. It's been placing its people very strategically in some of these agencies. I think Dr. Tedros, the head of the WHO, has for lack of a better word, a soft spot for China. So they've been able to get their way in a lot of things. And, you know, this didn't happen overnight. I mean, China has been at work for years and years and years in trying to kind of ingratiate itself, especially with developing countries. So take Africa. I mean, a lot of very cheap loans have been let out by China for infrastructure development. And recently, China has announced that it's going to be building in Addis Ababa the new Center for Disease Control headquarters for Africa. That's, I'm thinking it's bringing in yet about $80 million. And way back in 2012, it actually built the Africa Union headquarters, also in Addis Ababa. That was a $200 million gift. But wouldn't you know it, shortly afterwards, the African countries found out that the Chinese reportedly had spying devices within the building. So each night, quietly, data from the AU servers would be uploaded and sent to a building in Shanghai. So very interesting stuff there. China has been very enthusiastically rolling out its Belt and Road Initiative. That has to do with what I said earlier, African countries taking cheap money loans from China in order to build airports, roads, that sort of thing. But a lot of them are finding out that they can't repay these debts. So in some cases, for example, like Sri Lanka, China has actually taken over the port there and will first use it for commercial purposes, but don't be surprised if they use it for military purposes. And then finally, you know, we've all seen what's been happening with China towards Hong Kong. It managed to really crush the protest movement there, essentially through the imposition and without any dialogue, the national security law, which is very, very broadly worded, but it's put a lot of people behind bars or caused people to flee. And I think one of the things the Biden-Harris administration will be keeping a very close eye on is what happens with Taiwan, the Republic of China, just off the coast of China, whether having essentially swallowed Hong Kong, whether the Chinese dragon will still be hungry and go after the island of Taiwan. So that will really, really put to the test the kind of Taiwan-America alliance, because basically the United States is the main guarantor of Taiwan's security.
I mean, America probably would have to adopt a different tone from America first under the Trump administration to going on a bit of a charm offensive around the world. Because if it's to sort of put China back in its box, as it were, it needs to build alliances with multiple countries, which is very difficult because, as you know, that China for decades have actually been building those relationships in Africa and in Asia. And so and obviously there's a trade deal on the horizon with the EU. So I think, you know, the last few years with Trump at the helm has been quite damaging in terms of America's reputation and relationships with other countries, taking the America first approach when, you know, ultimately we live in an interconnected world and we need friends and allies, especially when, you know, these two superpowers will be slugging it out in the next decade. Now, with Biden in the White House, that also, you know, will have a shift in terms of America's approach to climate change. Now, obviously, we have the Paris Climate Treaty that Biden has signaled that it's one of the first issues that he'd like to deal with, and do a U-turn on basically what Trump walked away from. And then you have Google bosses such as, Sundar Pichai, who, recently said that he believes that AI and machine learning can also, make a huge impact and help with climate change. Do you think that next year we're going to actually start seeing a massive shift in the world coming together with, with all the sort of the big tech, as well as, the governments, not just virtue signaling, but actually being held to account because of this growing awareness amongst the public in terms of climate change and acceptance of it? So do you think 2021 will be the year where actually the world comes together?
I hope so. I think that up until now, a lot of world leaders have been sleepwalking their way through climate change. In fact, that's what I said, I believe it was 2 or 3 years ago on a BBC interview around this time of year when we were taking a survey of the world, and I don't think much has changed since then. the good news is that, yeah, Biden will on day one place America back into that Paris Climate Accord. But I think, Farzana, it's not only important what world leaders do, especially leaders of superpowers, but also what we do as individuals, what the private sector does. And I mean, I'm happy in the sense that a lot of corporations are stepping up to the plate and not waiting for governments or for blocs to take the initiative, and they're doing things themselves. And let me give you an example. Right close to you, Airbus. They have a very proactive and I think enlightened CEO, and he's pledged within the next 15 years to start putting out carbon neutral aircraft. I mean, that's an amazing feat.
Phenomenal. Yeah.
And there's now a lot of airlines, for example, experimenting with biofuels. Developers are looking at possibly the use of hydrogen, solar power, although that has very limited impact, especially on long haul and big aircraft. But having said that, I think there has to be more aggressiveness. For example, British Airways has said they're going to be carbon neutral by 2050, excuse me. No, they can, if they want, they can be near carbon neutral tomorrow, but they seem to be dragging their feet on now. If there's anything we've learned from this pandemic, it's really been a time for reflection, and company CEOs having a bit more time on their hands after they've stopped worrying about their futures have, had time to reflect on how to build back better. I think is really, really important, because a lot of that pressure, I think, will come from the traveling public, for instance, that I'm going to fly your airline because I like the feel of it. I like how you're, cutting your kind of environmental footprint, and it makes me feel good. The other thing, Farzana, I think we've seen, especially here in North America, Canada, and the United States, when dealing with global emergencies like the pandemic, is that it isn't always up to the federal or national government to do things. State governors and mayors and towns and villages can act on their own accord. And in fact, a lot have done so. In fact, I'll probably mention them later, but New York Governor Cuomo has said, it's horrible. It's disgusting, really, how the White House is dragging its feet in terms of vaccine rollout, but also dealing with arrivals from abroad. And he's taken the initiative himself to institute testing ahead of the US government. So you're going to see those types of initiatives. And finally, I need to say that, I live here in beautiful British Columbia, one of the most beautiful places on earth. We share the Pacific Northwest with our neighbors in Washington State and Oregon. But it was really, really a wake-up call this year when those wildfires that really afflicted badly California, Oregon, and Washington blew smoke over our shared border. For days and days, our beautiful vistas and views were gone. And it was kind of a double whammy, having the lockdown of the pandemic and then having that. But I think it was a wake-up call to a lot of people that things have to be done immediately. And for example, I think there'll be a lot more thought given now into expansion of urban neighborhoods. We now know that it's really stupid to build residential areas right up to the edge of vulnerable forests. So, but like I said, it isn't only the governments that need to take action, it's the private sector. But to end on a silver lining, I'm seeing a lot more interest in things like impact investing and ESG, investors saying, well, I'm going to put my money for companies who not only talk the talk, but walk it as well, that do impactful things to save the environment, to improve the environment. So there's a lot there to look out for, but I think there's a lot to be hopeful for as well.
I wanted to know your thoughts in terms of travel. So for instance, what is the future of travel? Are we going to get all zoomed out? Are we going to reduce our future business travel? And what about travel for fun, for tourism? Will the tourism sector recover? Will it just shift and people will be more likely to continue to travel, but travel perhaps less and travel more closer to home? So more sort of domestic tourism will then, will then boost. And then what about travel in terms of urban transport? I mean, here in London, we've seen the proliferation of bicycle lanes and a marked increase in people using bicycles and e-scooters, and so forth. And so what would be interesting to hear from from your perspective is these shifts that we're seeing during lockdowns and during the anxiety in terms of going into public transport or taking flights and being in sort of close proximity with others, and therefore increasing one's risk to getting COVID. Do you think that's going to just be a flash in the pan, and as soon as hopefully we manage to beat this virus, things will go back to normal? Or do you think that actually this is a permanent change in transport, in travel, that will be with us for years to come?
We're definitely going to see permanent and I think positive changes. I think a lot of us are stepping back and reflecting on how we're going to be doing travel in the future. I think you, I, and many others had a pretty crazy travel schedule beforehand, that we wouldn't give any thought even to accepting invitation to go halfway around the world, perhaps to Auckland or Sydney. And it was one trip after the other. We hardly paused to breathe. So I think that kind of shift in how often we travel, why we travel, where we travel, will not only be taken by us, but also by corporations. I think business travel will really be curtailed. And, for good reason, because, people have found out that, as much as that networking, that human contact is very important, things can be done quite efficiently via Zoom. But I really do want to underscore that line, that networking and human contact, that's the one thing that a lot of CEOs and others tell me that they're really missing. And diplomats are also telling me that there are some things that you just can't do over a Zoom call, especially when you're negotiating with armed non-state actors in places like Yemen. It needs to be eye to eye. One thing I did want to say, and this does anger me quite a bit, is that I'm seeing a really disconnect in messaging. You and I talk about communicating a lot, obviously, but a disconnect in messaging between the WHO and the national governments, the scientists, and the private sector, the airlines, the tourism companies, is it's getting worse and worse as the days go by. But they're really trying to tempt us to get on an airplane or to go to that resort island, to get out of the mundane aspect of lockdowns. But you know what? It isn't a safe time to travel. We shouldn't be traveling, especially with the emergence of this new, much more contagious virus. I think they have to stop it, and stop it now, because they're not doing themselves a favor. And it's really people who are already suffering from loneliness and boredom and lack of human connection. I think a lot of them are very vulnerable, and I think it's almost commercial exploitation that is going on. So that needs to be stopped right away, and they need to get on board and do what a lot of others are doing and reflect on, why we should be traveling. What is happening right now in a lot of places is people are obviously rediscovering where they live. They're doing staycations, they're vacationing, within 100 kilometers of where they live. And I think, at least what I've seen here on Vancouver Island, that's had a very beneficial effect, in the sense that the kind of city center has been forced to reinvent itself, because there are no American tourists anymore coming here. Our border is closed. So from a very kind of kitschy tourism type of capital to something where there are a lot more boutiques now, locally owned, selling local products. There's a lot more civic pride, I think, now among residents here, in terms of what we're going to see in our downtown core. So that's really cool. You asked about also how things are going to change in the cities themselves, bike lanes and things like that. That's happening in many of the cities I visited, that people are actually enjoying not getting in the car and traveling to go shopping or to work. So they're walking more, they're taking bicycles more. But let's not forget that there is a huge mass of people that are underprivileged, that they're forced to take the subway or they're forced to walk to work because they just don't have the money anymore. I mean, the impact on people's incomes is just gobsmacking. And it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. So those people, I really feel for them. I saw it in New York City, the beginning of the pandemic in March when I was there, that they're not able to social distance in the subway. They're not able to work from home because they don't have broadband or they don't even have computers. So that sector of society needs to be really thought of. But I'm hoping that we'll emerge from this a lot better in terms of travel, in terms of what our cities look like. And one last thought, if I may, Farzana, I hope that the ability to travel doesn't become the sole preserve of the wealthy and the privileged, because they can perhaps afford the private jets to go in those resorts where they have their own chalet or cabana, in the middle of a safari area in Africa. They're able to afford this isolation. So I think it's going to be really important to make sure that when we do return to traveling, that it's going to be done safely. There's a lot of work to be done still. I've seen airports and airlines do a lot to de-risk travel, but they're going to go. There's going to have to be a lot more confidence building measures to get people back up and running in the air and traveling.
So, Michael, going back to cities, do you think next year we're going to see an exodus from the great cities? Obviously, I live in London, and there's been talk about how property prices have been falling in the city, but actually increasing in rural areas as people want to go and live and work in areas of lower population density. And obviously, with the lack of commuting, you'll begin to see, city centres hollowing out. What's your thoughts in terms of real estate and property? Do you feel that we are going to get hit in certain sectors, such as, for instance, retail property, with the shops closing, and as consumers are buying more and more online, that will obviously impact retail property? Will that then the property become then repurposed, converted, for residential? I mean, what's your thoughts about that? Because again, it took place during COVID, all these changes, but for people to actually sell up in the cities and move to the country, it's quite it isn't a short-term commitment. So it shows that there is something there in the pipeline that's driving this, that would have sort of medium to long-term impact. What's your thoughts on how it's affecting real estate?
Yeah, there are a couple of really big shifts we're going to see. As my book really makes this clear, if there's anything about COVID, it's been a really accelerant for a number of trends. And one of the big ones will be the shift in work from those congested city cores to people's homes or to suburbs. But that was also pre-pandemic, because I think a lot of people, has hit them that climate change is here, and it's here in a very, very big way. So things like, the repetition of those monster storms, the flooding, the recurrent wildfires have forced people to reevaluate things and to move. The Black Lives Matter movement in the United States that triggered all of these protests, very, very justified, of course, the protests, but I think that also caused a lot of disruption to commerce and people's normal lives. So that's caused a shift away from urban centers. So, and because of the future of work, the way we're able to work remotely, do things from thousands of miles away. I mean, sometimes the way you and I and your team collaborate, we do it on opposite ends of the earth very seamlessly. So you can now go and move to a cabin in the middle of Montana, for instance, as long as you have good broadband, which they do have in many places now, you can continue your work and live a much more healthier and balanced life. So, but look, where are people going to go afterwards? I mean, we had a trend, for example, here on the West Coast where people were moving from California because it's congested, expensive, polluted, to Washington State, to places like Seattle, because it's home to a lot of high-tech companies like Microsoft and Amazon, Alaska Airlines. But then Seattle became too expensive, and it's become recently a very unsafe place to live. So friends of mine, for example, are now moving to Iowa or Idaho. So those places are really, really developing quickly. I was there recently in Idaho and saw the urban sprawl. If people get tired of that, where they move. So you know what I'm talking about, that
yeah.
This kind of has a chain reaction. But I think there's a lot of good news and bad news in that answer, but again, people just have to be very conscious now of the decisions they take for the long term, and remember that we all have a responsibility to protect the climate. We all have kind of a shared stewardship of those beautiful animals and mammals in our oceans, and we all have to take responsibility.
Michael, I wanted to pick your brains on another area. What we witnessed is obviously some sectors of the economy doing very well and other sectors really suffering. And so if you look, for instance, at at lab-grown meat, there's been a growing interest there because people are spending more time home thinking about things and being conscious of their purchasing habits and the impact it has on the supply chain and obviously how animals are farmed for human consumption, as well as the impact on the environment. But then you also have other sectors such as journalism that have been struggling before the pandemic with the advent of social media, brand journalism, and the influencers. So it would be great to hear your perspective on journalism. I mean, how has journalism been impacted during COVID? Will it be able to recover in the future? What's the future of journalism looking like?
Well, to be honest with you, not very well. In fact, I think I'm going to name my chapter on journalism Broken News, because you're right, even pre-pandemic, we have been seeing a lot of trends that have been causing layoffs and very, very good experienced journalists, the closure of media outlets, a shift from traditional media providers to a lot of people are now getting their news from Facebook and other online platforms where it's unfiltered and unverified in many ways. I think with the pandemic, again, to use that word, accelerant has accelerated some of those trends. The way big corporations, well, big and small, are suffering because of that pandemic has forced them to really rein in their marketing budgets, which has hence caused a real decline in advertising for media, which was already a broken model before the pandemic. So that's caused a lot of layoffs, a lot of closures. Having said that, as we reevaluate, as you and I have been talking about, where we live and what we eat, we've also been reevaluating, I think, how we've been consuming our news. And for example, now I've favorited on Twitter and on Facebook and a lot of other places, local media outlets that I hardly paid any attention to because I was traveling all the time.
Yeah.
And, I love supporting them and sharing news from them. And they're very, very good because in many ways, this pandemic is very local. We're very, very interested in how, for example, here on Vancouver Island, how many cases we have, how many deaths we've had, where the trends are going. So the local media outlets provide that in a very, very good way. The other thing I'll say, Farzana, is, you mentioned my travel. I have been trying to curtail it, but I took the decision early on, if I'm going to continue calling myself a global affairs analyst, I have to go out there. I can't remain in a bubble, in a Washington or Ottawa bubble. I have to go out there and see things for myself and talk to people. Not everyone is able to do that. Luckily, I am, but I do worry what's going to be happening in the future in terms of the deployment of things like foreign correspondents. You have, on the one hand, the bean counters in the newsrooms who are saying, well, hey, so-and-so doesn't need to be in Moscow anymore reporting on what's going on in Russia. He's been doing a great job from Vancouver. So let's keep it that way and maybe use stringers and grab video from here and there. And people don't care that much anymore about the quality of the video. It doesn't have to be perfect. So we're saving a lot of money.
Costs. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. They love that. And on the other hand, you probably have producers saying that, well, maybe there are different ways of doing things. We can keep these correspondents in place in the capitals, and we can use technology. We can use stringers and other means to get the story done. And I was recently, as an audience member, participated in a panel at the Frontline Club, and Clarissa Ward, the celebrated CNN journalist, was there. And I put that question to her, and she was pretty much in agreement, I think I could say, quite honestly, that, there should be a worry about how we're doing the reporting henceforth. And look, we cannot underestimate the importance of really, really good quality journalism. If there's another thing we've learned through this pandemic is that leaders need to be held accountable. And I think a lot of them have been using the pandemic in order to level the playing field in their favor, especially in more autocratic countries. The Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, excuse me, recently came out with their annual survey. There was something very interesting hidden in the stats there. It said that most of the arrests or detainment of journalists this year have been local. And I think part of that reason was that there were so fewer journalists out there doing the stuff that they do, that they're more prone to pick on locals. That still needs to be analyzed, that trend. We need to see what happens in 2021, but that's another trend that's happening. So kind of to wrap up that answer, excuse the length of it, but I think it's a really, really important topic to look at. And people should remember that if they're going to continue to have access to these local publications, whether they be physically printed or more and more so online, they need to be supported. So go out and donate to them, or in any other way you can support them. It's really, really going to be important going forward.
The world's response to COVID has been mixed. You have countries such as Singapore being perceived as doing exceptionally well when you compare Singapore to, say, for instance, the UK or the US. Why do you think that there has been such a difference between countries being able to adapt and bring in the test and trace and secure the PPE and have a compliant population that follows the rules? And also, as we move from the spotlight being on focusing on developing vaccines and moving towards distributing vaccines, what sort of challenges are we going to be facing, and how are people going to deal with the ethical dilemma of rich countries versus poor countries, and which ones get in line first and start buying up all of the doses, and how do the poor countries then protect? And because we are an interconnected world, we have to think about every human being on this planet, because of travel, because of globalization, every country will only be safe when every human being on this planet is safe from COVID. So what are your thoughts about the challenges that we're going to see in 2021 around the vaccine diplomacy, disinformation, anti-vaxxers? That could be the wild card where, as we hope that everyone will take the vaccine, there may be significant proportion of people who don't. So what does 2021 look like if you give us some future gazing?
Sure. Well, I think there's good news and bad news. Let me take kind of one of the last elements of your question first, and that's how the developing world will cope, especially African countries. And I am very worried, actually. I mean, we're seeing a resurgence in a lot of countries, especially South Africa, where, by the way, they do have their own second variant, the more infectious variant of COVID-19. I'm really, this is all fresh in my head right now because I'm writing about it in the book, but countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, officials there are now saying that they have no idea how and when their vaccines will come. Now, they're very dependent on the developed world. They're very dependent on institutions like the WHO, who does have this kind of COVAX project where wealthy countries have put money aside to allow the purchasing of vaccines for poorer countries. But I think a lot of these countries in Africa, like the DRC, who did so well in terms of fighting to the ground previous outbreaks, for example, Ebola, are very frustrated because they see what's happening is that a lot of the vaccines are going to the wealthier countries first. A lot of countries that were in line, that went into that queue early on, are going to get the vaccines before they do. As you well know, and probably a lot of your viewers know, Africa is becoming much, much more urbanized. The majority of the population is living in congested cities. So it's very, very easy, despite precautions taken in the past, for these outbreaks to spread very, very quickly and get out of control. So I really do worry about that. The trend about anti-vaxxers and disinformation is very, very big. Let me give you a quick example. In Ukraine right now, country, which we both know pretty well. I visit there frequently, but they're having a very, very tough time with the outbreak. And they're not in line, from what I can tell, for any vaccine, any of the big effective ones anyway. So they're now negotiating with China to get their vaccine, which hasn't been completely verified and tested. It could actually become a global vaccine, but I don't think we're there quite yet. A big reason for that too is because there's a lot of disinformation and people are reading it on Facebook and they're believing it. I get not a day goes by really, Farzana, where I get emails shared by very smart, experienced friends of mine, for example, in the United States, sharing a piece of information about the vaccine. Did you see this? Did you see this? And it always turns out to be false stuff. So I think big organizations like WHO, like the US CDC, are behind the curve on that disinformation front, that they need to fight it a lot earlier. But I think it's really important that world leaders get out there and say vaccines are safe, and they put the jab in their own arms as well. Recently, I interviewed a member of Joe Biden's COVID-19 advisory board, and he put it in a very stark way. He said what COVID-19 is a forest fire looking for human wood to burn. That's exactly what it does. So you have to fight this thing strongly and quickly. So during the Christmas period, we saw, our big jurisdiction here on Ontario stop or pause vaccination for the holidays. And we all know how overworked people in the health system are on the front lines. But look, giving a jab in the arm is not rocket science. It's not as easy as the polio vaccine where you administer it by the mouth, but people can be trained quite quickly to do this. And I think they dropped the ball on that one. And also we're finding that our northern communities, our isolated communities, where there's very, very high vulnerability, are also not going to be getting the vaccine anytime soon. So what needs to be done is, I think, a lot of information sharing of best practices of what works and what doesn't. But the big enemy, other than the vaccine itself, is that disinformation that is out there that needs to be battled with as aggressively as governments have been trying to battle this COVID-19 to the ground.
I think it was Warren Buffett who made a quote about when the tide goes out, you see who's swimming naked. And it brings me on to this topic of leadership and political leadership. And so what we've seen actually with the pandemic is some leaders stepping up and building their leadership credentials through their ability to communicate effectively, as well as managing the infection rates, the reinfection rates, and obviously there is like a global list of mortality rates that people are looking at, which is obviously very morbid, but it is seen as some sort of indicator in terms of how political leaders are grappling with the pandemic. I would love to know from your perspective, which world leaders do you think deserve a medal, and which ones would you put on the naughty step?
Well, it's a great question, and I think those that deserve the medal actually may not be big surprise to a lot of people, or happen to be female, and that didn't surprise me because I remember from my time with UNICEF. We did a lot of every year, it's the tradition of UNICEF to do this annual State of the World's Children's Report. And many of them actually point out that when you do have female leaders, heads of countries, for instance, they do tend to make more family-friendly decisions. They're more inclusive, they're more consultative. They do listen to their experts. So that has played itself out actually in this pandemic, where we've seen fantastic governance from female leaders, such as Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, where they only have a little over 2,000 cases and only 25 deaths. And I also compared some of these countries on a per capita basis, and they do very well there as well. But the country that has done the best, and some people may not like me referring to this island as a country, but I will for the purpose of this interview, is Taiwan. And Tsai Ing-wen, very, very popular president of Taiwan, has done a marvelous job crushing the curve there. Well, they didn't even have a curve. They've only lost less than 10 lives from fewer than 800 cases. So that translates into 1 case per 35,000 people and 1 death per 3.3 million.
Wow.
Best in the world. And not only that, their GDP growth is expected to be 2.5% in the first quarter of 2021. That's pretty impressive.
My God.
Then there have been people a little bit lower on the political ladder, if you will. Gladys Berejiklian, the Premier of New South Wales in Australia. I think she's someone a lot of Aussies tend to have a love-hate relationship with, but I listened to her messaging the other day and it was spot on. And I really like the way she commands the podium and seemed to be very, very no nonsense. And then I know there's someone that you have adoration for as well as New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, the brother of my friend, Chris Cuomo from CNN. And he, from the get-go, was doing very, very good messaging, appearing every morning to the people of New York and saying, this is what you've got to do. This is the only way we're going to fight this to the ground, and really standing up to the bully in the White House, Donald Trump. I think New Yorkers, they call it the Empire State, the people of the Empire State, have really been proud of Mr. Cuomo. And like I said earlier, taking these proactive steps. Well, if the federal government is not going to take steps to prevent this very infectious strain from coming to the United States, well, we're going to do it too by doing our own testing at JFK Airport. So he's been a kind of role model to a lot of other premiers and governors. The governor of Michigan as well has been very good. And then Singapore, Prime Minister Lee has been doing a great job. Singapore did have a pretty high spike in cases earlier on. They managed to bring it down through what they call a very strict circuit breaker of lockdowns. They did have a couple of blind spots, including their huge migrant worker communities where the infection spread very quickly in the crowded dormitories there. That has happened before. They should have learned their lesson and taken measures here. But overall, in terms of taking strict measures, he did it. But he did benefit from the legacy of his father, Lee Kuan Yew, the modern founder of Singapore, who actually was a germaphobe and instituted this cleanliness mentality among Singaporeans, instituting fines for things like chewing gum or dropping gum or relieving yourself on the street. That was all dealt with very early on. So I think the mindset in Singapore was there. They were predisposed to listen to official advice. And also in Singapore, you have, some might call it incestuous relationship between the private and public sector, the so-called Singapore Inc. But you know what? I'm writing about how technology went from bad to good boy in this pandemic. And in Singapore, they proved that by instituting very early on these really cool apps and Bluetooth tokens that will alert you if you've been exposed. So, and for that, they did tap the knowledge of the private sector. And kind of to end on this, the other cool thing they're doing is creating a kind of business bubble near Changi Airport where foreign business people can come to Singapore. They can isolate in this bubble, but they can continue to do business with their local partners or prospective partners in a very, very safe environment. And that to me is a kind of eloquent expression of the Singapore spirit in terms of being proactive and looking ahead and how can we do things to, put us back to where we were. And that's a really good example. So in terms of the bad guys, I don't know. You can't take up too much more of your time, but Trump is, of course, way up there. I think he's been very negligent in how he's handled this. He's basically away on leave right now, spending time on his golf course, where he should be spending more time figuring out how to bring more relief to the millions and millions of Americans who are about to lose literally the roof over their heads. The disinformation he put out early on, calling it a hoax, refusing to wear a mask, things like that. It's just been a horrible experience. So I think the attention of the US public is now shifting from Trump to President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris, and their messaging is fantastic. The Boris Johnson, your leader, has contradicted himself, I think, so many times. At first, trying to project himself as kind of Santa Claus, saying, no, Christmas will not be canceled, and then going ahead and doing it. I think he did no favors to himself or to his party. I have admiration for French President Macron, but as much as you like to be a workaholic and like business travel, you have to cool it sometimes. And what he did going to that EU summit, and that caused not only him getting sick, but apparently some other leaders, or forced them into self-isolation, that was irresponsible. So I think that will that hopefully will be a lesson for other leaders. And then there are the bad boys that we've come to expect, the autocrats, who, as I said earlier, have leveraged coronavirus to level the playing field in their favor. For example, canceling elections, jailing opponents, banning protests, harsh measures, instituting harsh measures that have no expiration date. I really worry about some of those countries. But overall, I think it's forced a lot of leaders to step up to the plate. We really, really have to give a lot of credit to the chief public health officers who have kind of operated quietly in the background, but when pandemics happen, they've been pushed in a way by the politicians up front to speak to the public. And they've done a fantastic job. A lot of them are real heroes for doing what they've done. And, you know, of course, the frontline health workers, they're really, really working hard, but also suffering right now. And I'll end on one note, if I can, that I heard from the other day from a manager of the Los Angeles County health system, who is very eloquent and to the point, and who's under tremendous pressures right now. They're having a really tough time. She said it really is wonderful how the public around the world has come out and, you know, celebrated these health workers, but we're now feeling after so many months that these words or these expressions are ringing a bit hollow, because people are still heading for the airport. They're still traveling. They're still going to big shopping centers and not social distancing or wearing masks. So if you're going to really respect them, take those well-known measures and, you know, practice what we've been telling you to do.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michael, so much. And you know, to end on a positive note, you know, Boris Johnson has been the king of U-turns. However, he has managed to get us a deal for Brexit. True. So we have a silver lining at the end of 2020. Thank you so much for being our future gazer into 2021. I wish you a wonderful, safe, healthy year ahead and beyond. And thank you again for enlightening us. Thank you.
And I look forward to future collaboration and your wonderful team. And I think we're both going to be careful henceforth with our travel and so on. But I see the day soon, hopefully, where we'll be able to meet in person. I don't know whether we're going to be able to hug or even shake hands in the near future, but I'm sure we'll find some way to share our expressions of affection and gratitude.
Brilliant. Thank you. All the best.
All the best.